But if you are not Japanese, what then is the real Japan? The Japan of the geographer, the anthropologist, and the historian. The Japan of which the Japanese themselves know little or nothing. The name Japan comes from two Chinese words, ji and pen, the literal translation of which is the land where the sun comes from. The Chinese called it that because Japan lay to the east. Geographers say Japan is a chain of volcanic islands, 1,200 miles long and an average of 120 miles wide, her total land mass being a little larger than the state of California. Rocky and mountainous, only 16% of Japan is suitable for farming. Every human being in Japan lives within sight of mountains, many of them from 6,000 to 12,000 feet high. There are some 50 active volcanoes scattered through Japan. On an average of 4 times a day, Japan has earthquakes, severe shocks occurring about once every 2.5 years, with one disastrous earthquake about every 25 years. There are some 45 cities with a population of over 100,000, only 3 of which are beyond the range of 16-inch naval guns. Tokyo, the capital, with a population of 7,900,000, is the 3rd largest city in the world. And what of the people of Japan and their so-called divine origin? Anthropologists say the original inhabitants of the islands were a hairy barbarian people called Ainus. Later on, fierce Mongolian tribes moved in and began conquering the Ainus. Still later, other tribes from many sources arrived on the scene. The fusion of all these tribes and races resulted in the Japanese of today, not of one pure blood, but of a well-mixed plasma cocktail of Ainu, Mongol, Manchu, Malaysian. Of the history of Japan, historians say that somewhere around the beginning of the Christian era, they elevated to leadership a chief, or high priest, in this case the emperor, who claimed to have an inside track with the gods. This evolved into Shintoism, and the emperor's son myth became the dominant religion. But the early emperors had little political power, for the islands were really divided into many independent and quarrelsome tribes, ruled over by powerful barons or daimyos. These daimyos each had large, well-paid private armies of warriors called samurai. The samurai were the important and privileged class, real aristocrats who lived off the fat of the land without working. As a badge of rank, they wore 2 swords, a short sword for committing harakiri when captured or disgraced, and a large 2-handed sword they fought with. With this sword, it was their privilege to lop off heads, arms, or ears of the peasants, either for practice or amusement. To further set themselves apart from the common herd, the samurai developed a code of rules for themselves called Bushido, the code of the warrior. Bushido extolled absolute loyalty to one's superior and reckless bravery in battle. But most important, Bushido not only sanctioned double dealing and treachery, but looked upon it as an art to be cultivated. It encouraged ambush. Jump a man from behind when he's unarmed and you've got a club. When he's alone and you've got a gang. That's Bushido, the art of treachery and the double cross. The national code of Japan. Harakiri was also a privilege of the samurai. When condemned to death, they were allowed to kill themselves rather than be beheaded. The executioner's axe was for the common people. As a result, harakiri became an elaborate ceremony, a form of art that showed bravery and indifference to pain. A man's son or his best friend stood by with a big sword to chop his head off in case he lost his nerve. The daimyos and their paid samurai engaged in unending bloody civil wars against each other for the right to become the shogun. Being the shogun meant being top dog among all the daimyos, a dictator of dictators, ruling the islands in the name of the emperor, who was kept in the background as a religious figurehead.
In the year 1592, the powerful shogun Hideyoshi thought he and Japan were strong enough to make their first bid to cover the world with the Japanese route. And as they have ever since, they picked China as the first victim. Hideyoshi invaded Korea, but Chinese from other provinces came to the aid of the Koreans. The Japs were stopped, and when Hideyoshi died suddenly, the invasion was called off. But they did a complete job of plunder, taking back with them all the wealth and art they could carry. They also brought back 30,000 pickled ears and noses of Chinese and Koreans killed in battle. These they buried in what is now known as the ear mound in the city of Kyoto. It was around this period that something new came into the midst of this warring, bloodthirsty people. Something new and strange. In the year 1521, Magellan had sailed around the world to the Philippines. In his wake came Spanish and Portuguese missionaries who eventually visited the Japanese islands. The strange new thing they brought was Christianity, the revolutionary doctrine of peace on earth and the equality and brotherhood of man. Here was something that dignified the lowly Japanese serfs as human beings. Soon there were some 200 churches and over 200,000 converts. The warlords became frightful. These foreign medicine men were teaching tolerance, brotherly love, peace, and even equality. So they acted. 137 churches were destroyed in Nagasaki. All Christian converts in Tokyo were burned at the stake. Throw out the West. Throw out its poisonous doctrine of peace. And with that, Japan closed its doors. No one could leave Japan. No one could enter. Foreign sailors shipwrecked on their shores were tortured and beheaded. For 200 years, Japan remained completely isolated. And in those 200 years, the world advanced more than it had in the previous 1,000 years. Voltaire lived, and Washington, Jefferson, Franklin, Pasteur. The Americans fought a revolution for the belief that all men were created equal. The French fought for liberty, equality, and fraternity. The power of steam was discovered, and the steamboat and steam engine began to narrow the oceans and continents. The telegraph was invented. China was opened up to the trade of the world. But during all this time, Japan was closed. No news reached her shores. She remained a nation blacked out from the rest of the world, still living in the Middle Ages. Then, in 1853, just 92 years ago, Commodore Perry's American fleet of 4 ships sailed into Yokohama, bearing a message from President Fillmore offering the hand of friendship and the interest of trade. The Japanese warlords woke with a shock from their 200 years of self-imposed isolation. They realized that the hairy white barbarian had machines and weapons that made him powerful. If the sons of heaven were to rule the earth, their spears and swords would be of little avail. Also, they realized how weak and divided they really were compared to Western nations. Hastily, the feuding barons stopped fighting among themselves and joined together. But they needed a central figure around whom they could rally. Available was the God Emperor, who up to now had been more or less of a stooge. So, in 1868, the warlords did away with the position of shogun and elevated Emperor Meiji to supreme dictatorship over all Japan, reserving for themselves and themselves alone the right to speak for him and to guide his policies, a position the warlords have hung on to ever since. Now for a strong military. The paid warriors, the samurai, were too few for a national army, so they introduced another revolutionary idea into Japanese life. The sons of peasants were suddenly permitted the great privilege of bearing arms, and it was a great privilege, for being a soldier almost meant being a noble. And to sell this program to the Jap masses, the warlords shrewdly used religion. They revised ancient Shintoism to suit their purpose and forced emperor worship, military glorification, and fanatic thoughts of conquest to be preached by all Shinto priests. Thus, Japan rid herself of the old samurai, but their fanatical spirit was passed on to the new peasant soldier, Bushido code and all. The warlords now flung open their doors to the West. Posts and telegraphs were introduced, railroads, the European calendar, photography, European dress. A frenzy of modernization seized upon the land. With a politeness such as the world has seldom seen, the Japanese invited other nations to help them build up their military power. And always with the thought, treat with the foreigner, learn his weapons, and then use them to destroy him. The old Bushido double cross. The English, having the best navy in the world, were invited to build up and train the Japanese navy. The French, supposed to have the best army in the world, were invited to train the Japanese army. But when they saw the French defeated by the Germans in the Franco-Prussian War, the Japanese switched to German advisors for their army. From the English and the Americans, they borrowed the outward forms of democracy, the ministers and their representative body, the Diet. But this was all a cruel joke, for the Army and Navy cabinet ministers, still actually descendants of the old feudal barons, are above and beyond any law-making body. They have direct access to the emperor and can entirely bypass the civil government. In fact, whatever Japan took from the West or the Chinese, the warlords never took the moral or ethical principles that went with them. All modern knowledge that has come to the Japanese people, all culture, all ideas, all thinking has been filtered through to the people from the top down. Any new idea is first tried out by the ruling classes, changed to suit their purpose, then with the emperor's blessing handed down to the people as divine law. In our Western civilization, practically all the ideas, the forces that have changed our thinking have come from the bottom up. Evolution or revolution starts with the people. With the Japs, evolution is handed down to the people. Japan was westernized by decree, not by popular desire. In spite of westernization, everyone in Japan still rules over his inferior and in turn bows down to his superiors just as they did in the Middle Ages. Women have the least standing of all. They must obey the males in all things. Even today, there isn't any moral right or wrong in Japan. Merely, are you or are you not obedient to your superiors? For instance, today, a father still has the power to sell his daughter when she is 11 or 12 to a factory or a mill. She will eat, sleep, and go to school in the factory, but all her earnings will go to her father. Or if she is a little older and he needs money, the father can sell her outright to a geisha house or house of prostitution. And modernization has done even less for the standard of living. Individual welfare still doesn't count. Discomfort is supposed to be a divine virtue. And that's why the people of Japan all work as long as they can, and as soon as they can, and as hard as they can. For they, too, consider themselves as soldiers with a divine mission. These women beat the earth in humble rhythm just as they did 1,000 years ago. These women work day after day, month after month in the rice fields, human machines producing rice and soldiers. Over their heads fly the latest planes to the wars. A diesel train thunders past. But these farmers work and live and eat like they did in the 17th century. The income for the whole family as high as $150 a year and as low as $16 a year. The Jap peasant works harder, eats less, and pays more taxes than any other peasant on earth, but he seldom complains, for he is carrying out the divine will of the emperor. The white-collar Japanese in the daytime uses telephones and adding machines. But when he goes home, he puts on a kimono and lives as his ancestors did in the Middle Ages. Japanese houses have no foundations. There are no walls as we know them. No windows, no paint, no varnish, no curtains, no chairs, and no beds. To sleep, they spread a couple of quilts on the floor with no sheets and lay their heads on hard, round pillows. Their food lacks albumin, fats, and sugar. The standard of living is the same as it was hundreds of years ago, one of the lowest on earth. For Japan became industrialized not to raise the standard of living, but to prepare for conquest. This man in the factory doesn't work a 6-day, 48-hour week for good wages. He works a 72-hour week at starvation wages and frequently dies of tuberculosis at the age of 40.
Why do Japan's millions accept their fate in dumb, regimented silence? Why don't they rebel, revolt, organize labor unions? Well, first of all, having dedicated their lives to the emperor, belief in Japan's divine mission to conquer runs through the whole people. This makes practically all of them willing prisoners of a vicious, ironclad social structure, a system of regimentation so perfect it made Hitler's mouth water. On top of the heap of this social structure are leaders of the Army and Navy, the warlords who surround the emperor. They are Japan's first team. Nearly equal in power are the half-dozen super-rich industrial aristocratic families who own the wealth. They're the second team. And they play ball with the military rulers because the warlords give them cheap, uncomplaining labor and lush profits. And they, in turn, provide the money for the war machines. Next in line are the professional politicians, who are appointed by the government as rulers over the 47 provinces. These political stooges slavishly follow orders because their jobs and their very lives depend on the whims of the Army and Navy leaders. At the bottom of the heap are the peasants and workers, the hoi polloi, the masses. To make sure the masses stay in their place, there are the police, the gendarmes, the Japanese Gestapo, and the billions of ghosts of dead Japanese ancestors who watch over every act of the living. And just in case some Japanese don't believe in ghosts, they have an efficient, unique Japanese invention, the thought police. Yes, thought police, whose business it is to arrest you if you think dangerous thoughts. Who decides when your thinking is dangerous? That's easy. The thought police decides. About 10,000 people a year are arrested for thinking bad, selfish, dangerous thoughts. To keep the aristocrats and government officials from straying from the straight and narrow Japanese line, there is another strictly Japanese invention, secret organizations like the dreaded Black Dragon Society. This secret gangster organization, made up of thousands of fanatics, was headed by one of the world's most sinister characters, Mitsuru Toyama, chief of Japan's Murder Incorporated, sometimes called the unofficial emperor. 90 years old when he died in 1944, this dreaded master murderer held the threat of death over everyone in Japan who dared oppose the warlords too strongly. 1930. Premier Hamaguchi shot down at his desk. 1932. Prime Minister Inukai. Finance Minister Inouye. Baron Takuma Dan, head of the House of Mitsui. 1936. 4 political leaders killed. Prime Minister escapes. Brother-in-law shot by mistake. But the main reason the warlords have been able to maintain their vicious grip on Japan lies in the educational system. Education is compulsory in Japan. 97% of the Japs are literate. But the Japanese school is not an institution for the development of the mind. It is a government-controlled institution designed to teach only officially selected facts and officially approved ideas. The object is to mass-produce students who all think alike. To teach in the shortest possible time only the knowledge and skills necessary to make the student an obedient, loyal subject of the divine emperor. The children are taught only how to do things. Their minds absorb the official lessons like a sponge absorbs water. And like a squeezed sponge, they give back the same water. Teachers are trained only by the government. and only those fanatically loyal to the emperor are allowed to teach. Here are some of the divine thoughts that are hammered home every day.
Our lives will become sincere and true only when they are offered to the emperor and the state. Our race has before it a great ideal, a great commission to assimilate the earth and the universe.
Thus, from childhood, the Japanese are taught they are descendants of gods, a race apart and superior to all others, born for only one purpose, to dedicate their lives to the emperor. The cardinal virtue, obedience to superiors. The cardinal ambition, Mako Ichiu, to cover the earth under a Japanese roof. That is, briefly, the social structure of Japan. That is the vicious system of political and religious regimentation that hammers, kneads, and molds the whole population until it becomes an obedient mass with but a single mind.